네, 잠시 안내 말씀드리겠습니다. 안내해드린 바와 같이 잠시 후 오후 3시부터 본 총회가 시작될 예정입니다. 아직 입장하지 않으신 분들께서는 속히 입장해 주시기 바랍니다. 네, 그리고 온라인으로 함께 해주신 분들도요, 오후 3시부터 시작되는 총회 많은 관심 부탁드리도록 하겠습니다. Ladies and gentlemen, may I have attention please? The General Assembly of 2020 Asian Economic Community Forum will begin shortly. For those who haven't entered yet, please come into the hall and be seated prepared. 네, 다시 한번 안내 말씀드리겠습니다. 네, 고지해드린 바와 같이 잠시 후 오후 3시부터 2020 아시아 경제 공동체 포럼 총회가 시작될 예정입니다. 네, 아직 입장하지 않으신 분들께서는 속히 입장하셔서 마련된 좌석에 착석해 주시기 바랍니다. 그리고 온라인으로 함께 해주신 분들도요, 오후 3시부터 잠시 후부터 시작되는 총회에 많은 관심과 참여 부탁드리도록 하겠습니다. Ladies and gentlemen, may I have attention please? Today's General Assembly of 2020 Asian Economic Community Forum will begin soon. So for those who haven't entered yet, please come into the hall and be seated prepared. Thank you for your cooperation. 네, 그럼 지금부터 2020 아시아 경제 공동체 포럼의 총회를 시작하도록 하겠습니다. From now on, we'll start the General Assembly of the 2020 Asian Economic Community Forum today. 네, 본 총회 주제는요, 동북아와 유럽의 비교 시각에서 본 지역 통합의 정치 경제학입니다. The theme of this General Assembly is political economy of regional integration from the comparative perspective of Northeast Asia and Europe. 네, 그럼 본 총회의 좌장을 맡아 진행해 주실 박재훈 인천대학교 교수님을 소개해 드리도록 하겠습니다. Let me introduce the moderator for the session for the General Assembly, Mr. Park Jae-hoon, Professor of International University. Please welcome Rita Bican. 여러분 큰 박수로 맞아주시기 바랍니다.
Good afternoon, everyone. As you just heard from the MC, the topic, the theme of this plenary session is political economy of regional integration from the comparative perspective of Northeast Asia and Europe. So today we have three speakers for this session. The first speaker is Gerald Roland from UC Berkeley. He's gonna talk about China's geopolitical ambitions in Asia and in the world in the time of COVID-19. So he will make his speech from pre-recorded video. And second speech will be done by former Undersecretary General of United Nations, Kim Won-soo. His topic is about future direction of Northeast Asian cooperation. And the third speaker will be Dr. Philip de Lombarde from United Nations, CRIS. CRIS is comparative regional integration studies. His topic is from old regionalism to new regionalism and back. So he'll talk about some kind of new trend of regionalism. We have 4 panelists. One is from United States, Joseph Brada from Arizona State University. He'll attend as Zoom participation. And second discussant will be Professor Satoshi Mizubata from Kyoto University, Japan. And he will also attend as Zoom participation. And the third discussant will be Professor Park Sung-hoon from Korea University. And lastly, but not the least, Professor Lee Ho-chul from Incheon National University. So let us begin with the first speech done by Professor Roland. You will see from video, critical video.
The topic of my talk is China's geopolitical ambitions in Asia and in the world in the time of COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic appears to be a pivotal moment for the post-Cold War situation. What could have been early on a Chernobyl moment for China became instead a triumph for China's communist regime and a pivotal moment in the decline of the West. European countries, and mostly the US, have severely mishandled the pandemic in contrast to most Asian democracies. But China's wolf warrior diplomacy gives us the image of power-drunk leaders who expect the rest of the world to kowtow to China by using threats. These threats and the rise of extremist nationalism in China should serve as a wake-up call for China's neighbors and the rest of the world. So I'm going to ask, what are China's geopolitical ambitions in the long run, in the short run? And I want to say that the international community, and especially democratic countries in the world, must realize the seriousness of the current situation. So I will spell out the need and conditions for containment of rising China, but the conditions for quote unquote a new Cold War are not the same as after World War II. These issues are particularly important for South Korea given its geographical situation and the presence of the North Korean regime. So to understand the ambitions of China, one needs to see what drives China's leaders. So the main goal of Chinese communist leaders in the last 40 years has been to stay in power and consolidate their power. This was the avowed reason for the economic reforms launched by Deng Xiaoping and leading to a market economy. So given the failures of all centrally planned economies that led to the political implosion of communist political regimes, Deng Xiaoping had the foresight to understand that economic success mimicking the East Asian export strategy could prevent regime collapse in China. And so far, this has been an unmitigated success and has changed the world. Now, a big question that many ask is, do Chinese leaders want to spread communism in the world? After the October Revolution, the goal of communist leaders was to establish communist regimes throughout the world. World War II led to the introduction of communist regimes in Central Europe, China, Vietnam, North Korea, and there's a long list. The international goal shared by all communist parties was the major stake of the Cold War. Western Europe barely escaped the establishment of communist regimes, South Korea even more. So this was certainly an existential threat to the world, given the goal of communist leaders to establish communist regimes throughout the world. Communist parties exploited their victories against the Nazis, against the Japanese militarists, to expand their influence. But the failure of centrally planned economies everywhere in the world meant, in reality, a death blow to communist ideology. So what Chinese leaders did is abandon central planning and introduce capitalism, all that under a communist political regime. The Chinese communist leaders know that communist ideology has been refuted by its total economic failure, but they hang on to power and praise the advantages of communist autocracy as quote unquote efficient governance. They have no ambition to promote the establishment of communist regimes in the world, with the exception of Hong Kong and Taiwan, but have nevertheless strong ambitions for the place of communist China in the international scene. Having abandoned communist internationalism, which existed at the time of the Cold War, their domestic legitimacy relies on a combination of economic but also geopolitical success, satisfying strongly nationalist grassroots aspirations inside China. The Belt and Road Initiative, it's been a little bit less in the limelight lately, but has been really very important for the strategy of Chinese leaders. The Belt and Road Initiative can be understood in light of the economic and geopolitical objectives that I just defined. The economic goal of Chinese leaders is to keep Chinese growth rates at a higher level than world growth rates, because economic success is part of their legitimacy. By having growth rates that are higher than world growth rates, you can keep this legitimacy. So that's fundamentally what is at the heart of the BRI program. And the Chinese leaders want to do this through infrastructure investments, yielding better access to imports of natural resources, and also the concomitant growth of exports. As the Chinese economy grows and grows, and given the size of its economy, its need for imports of natural resources will always become stronger and stronger. The BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, also creates economic interdependencies that make countries who receive funding from China reluctant to criticize or to contradict China on the international stage. The BRI will also necessitate the establishment of Chinese military bases along trade routes. Indeed, to protect these trade routes that are going to be more and more of strategic importance for the Chinese leaders, they understand that there could be a danger of embargo, blockade, and so they will try to establish Chinese military bases all along the trade route. They already have one in Djibouti. They're thinking of putting one in Sri Lanka. They started, and possibly in other places in the world. Now, the establishment of military bases all along these trade routes will, of course, be seen as a big, big threat to the rest of the world. But we have to understand that its goal is really to pursue higher growth rates than the world growth rates as the economic legitimacy of the Chinese leaders. So now, the COVID moment. After initial failures to react to the spread of the coronavirus and repression of attempts to alert the general public, we can think of the heroic Dr. Li Wenliang, who unfortunately died as a whistleblower, but also others. There was drastic lockdown, but also national mobilization for Wuhan, where people came from all over China. Wuhan was completely blocked, but they came from all over China to come and make sure they had enough food, medicine, et cetera, et cetera. And this drastic lockdown and national mobilization, which was more heavy-handed than what we've seen in democratic Asian countries, but at least it led to success in dealing with the pandemic. The abject failure of the Trump administration to manage the pandemic put China's management of the pandemic in a positive light, and they unabashedly repeat this message all the time. Inside China, especially among the elite and among the top leaders, this was seen as a unique opportunity to overtake the US as the most important world power, which is why the current moment is really a pivotal moment in the international arena. China presented itself as a world leader, touting its initiatives in sending personal protective equipment all across the world, masks, ventilators, etc. Many of those had been given to China after the beginning of the pandemic, but this was presented to the outside world as China's generosity towards the rest of the world. I have many, many Chinese friends, very good friends, and I did receive many proposals to send me masks, given how bad the situation was in the United States. So concomitant with this Chinese success after the initial failure, we have seen a real increase in Chinese arrogance. This was revealed by the messages from what are called the wolf warrior diplomats, who have been extremely aggressive on the international scene. And so, especially from diplomats, this can seem a little bit a paradox, but that's the reality. Fake videos were circulating about Italians cheering China from their balconies in lockdown. These were fabricated. Italians love to sing, but their first reflex is not to sing the Chinese national hymn, but rather Italian opera and other things, Italian songs. There were allegations that the coronavirus was brought to Wuhan by the military. There have been attempts to silence international voices that dared mention China's initial failure, or the contrast between drastic measures to prevent the coronavirus to spread within China, but absences of measure to prevent its spread abroad, which led to the current international pandemic we're in. Wolf warrior diplomats and Chinese leaders made threats to Australia because of its support for international investigation inside China. There were threats against French leaders, US leaders, of course, English leaders, etc. We have seen at the same time an armed conflict at the border with India, an increased military presence and intimidation in the South China Sea, presence of a Chinese Navy in Taiwan Straits, of planes flying more and more over Taiwan, etc., etc. So it's quite clear that the China's success in handling with COVID led to a increased arrogance from its leaders. So what are China's geopolitical priorities? For decades, the main avowed priority of China's communist regime has been to fully incorporate Hong Kong and Taiwan inside the communist regime. These goals have been hammered in through propaganda for decades and decades and have acquired a sacrosanct status. This is a goal that you cannot touch, you cannot even call it into question. If you call them into question, you are seen as a traitor inside China or an enemy of China outside of China. Hong Kong was to be returned to China by 2047, but the one country, two systems that was introduced in 1997 actually accelerated things. Nixon, and also Kissinger's recognition of one China under the China diplomacy of the US opened the road for Taiwan's international isolation. At the time, the US wanted to amplify the division between the Soviet Union and China, and also receive help from China for an exit from the Vietnam War that the Americans were losing. But it is not clear that the concession on Taiwan was necessary. Maybe it served as a commitment device that the US would not attack mainland China. Nevertheless, it's fair to say that in hindsight, the isolation of Taiwan was a terrible thing for its inhabitants. The one country, two systems in Hong Kong has been de facto ended with the national security law that was imposed from Beijing this year, and that Hong Kong's leaders had not even read. Xi Jinping, by the way, has been hostile to the one country system since coming to power. Observers have recorded this since 2012, and he de facto ended it with the national security law. So now the communist regime is gradually being introduced in Hong Kong. We should not close our eyes before this. First, there has been the repression that is continuing slowly, but continuously. There are plans for school textbook reform that would be completely inspired by Chinese communist propaganda. Then there should be judicial reforms to get rid of the Hong Kong judges. The goals have been asserted openly by Chinese leaders. Eliminating elections that were supposed to take place for the legislature were delayed by 1 year, but they may probably never take place or take place in an environment that would be, absolute caricature of democracy. The Communist Party is becoming the de facto power, sidelining the role of Hong Kong executive and Hong Kong government. So the Communist Party of China managed to end the protests that started in 2019 against the extradition law, so that goal was achieved by the national security law. When we look at Hong Kong, we see that the older generation often is more friendly to the Communist Party, but those born after 1997 have no knowledge of British colonialism and were educated with democratic values. So the takeover of Hong Kong can be seen as an experiment in managing a hostile Chinese population in an economically prosperous place. There are differences with Tibet and Xinjiang and possibly Inner Mongolia that are non-Han populations and that take place within the current territory of China. So this means that Taiwan is facing immense dangers. After the communist takeover of Hong Kong, Taiwan will obviously never accept a one country, two systems, given the lack of commitment of the Communist Party autocracy. The Chinese leaders can try to recover Taiwan by a combination of stick and carrot. The preferred scenario would be to take full control over the Kuomintang that would win a presidential election via electoral fraud. That's one scenario. The Communist Party of China can plant a large number of agents in Taiwan to influence opinion via social media. We see this everywhere in the world now, the influence of extremists with social media, but possibly also in the worst case scenario, create disturbances that would trigger a Chinese intervention like in Hong Kong. They would be ready to engage in military blockade or even outright invasion. The world did not react militarily to Crimea's invasion, so Russia only received sanctions. But Crimea's population was pro-Russian. So a real fundamental question for Taiwan's future is how strong is the US commitment to Taiwan? It has to be 100% strong, otherwise any uncertainty will be exploited by the Chinese. The Chinese leaders are patient, but their goal is to recover Taiwan before 1949, the centenary of the communist takeover. And so Taiwan will be a major stake in the new Cold War with China. Xi Jinping will not want to wait that long. His personal ambitions far outweigh his intellect, which is very dangerous. He has no good understanding of the reasons behind China's economic success. He already destroyed China's succession system by giving himself more than 10 years or giving the prospects. He destroyed China's parallel information system by introducing a climate of terror where leaders are afraid to give bad information. He destroyed the one country, two systems in Hong Kong. He destroyed consensual decision-making in the Politburo Standing Committee and is encouraging cultural revolution-style hysteria inside China. So it's useful to see China's international ambitions with Sinocentric concentric circles. The Chinese view of the world is profoundly Sinocentric. Everything is seen through the prism of China. China's view of the international order is it purely Sinocentric and meant mainly to further its economic growth objectives. Of course, as it grows, it also wants its geopolitical weight to grow together with its economic weight. Now, with economic development, invasion of foreign countries is less advantageous than it was in the past, even in the early first half of the 20th century. Human capital is now a more important factor of production than land, and human capital cannot be coerced that easily. Natural resources can be obtained more easily through international trade than through invasion. Moreover, it's more costly for a communist regime like China to invade a country because it needs to control all of society through Communist Party cell. They're already facing a similar problem in sparsely populated Tibet, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia, and they're putting a lot of resources because they don't really control those territories, even though they're inside China. So a more realistic scenario, besides recovering Hong Kong and Taiwan, for Chinese leaders is to try to transform foreign countries in tributary states and create concentric circles of tributary states. In Chinese history, non-Han polities were treated as tributary states. They sent fees and presents to the emperor. They were seen as satellite states in the particular Confucian-style hierarchy of foreign countries and polities. This was the case of Tibet, but also Vietnam for a long time, and actually most Asian countries at one point or another through history. China can use economic dependency and threats to force countries to behave in a way demanded by Chinese leaders. Recent pressures on Australia, but also the Philippines, South Korea with THAAD missiles are certainly a good illustration. So this leads to the need for containment and a new Cold War. One needs to contain China's drive towards world hegemony. China's economic and geopolitical weight must be countered by an alliance of all democratic countries. Provocations at South China Sea in India, Taiwan, and other parts of the world must be countered, otherwise they will become increasingly bold. So what is different from the first Cold War? China's economy is much more powerful than the Soviet economy at the beginning of the Cold War. It is still growing very strongly. It has a flow of technological progress, and there's really no prospect of economic collapse. China's population is the largest in the world, much larger than the Soviet bloc ever was. China is also strongly integrated in the world economy, which is a two-sided road that brings both strength and weaknesses. Now, communist ideology is dead, and China has imperialist goals, not eschatological goals. These are not ideological. These are really power goals. There's no communist international under China's leadership, just Chinese diasporas and spy networks. So what kind of containment policies? The first goal is to build a solid, institutionalized alliance of robust democracies in Asia, in the Americas, Europe, and Africa. Russia and other non-democracies can currently not be included, but maybe later on. There is the need for some kind of Asian NATO to contain China based on that alliance. There's a need for policies to reduce the economic dependency of democracies on trade with China. This is partial decoupling. Some of it is already taking place. There's a need for joint policies to prevent Chinese foreign investment from taking strategic positions outside of China. There also needs to be a strong push against Chinese spying to steal technological secrets. I have to say that banning Chinese students is not a solution and would actually be counterproductive. We also need to know China's weaknesses. There's a lack of soft power. The mask strategy tried a soft power failed. Of course, selling their ideology, selling their totalitarianism is certainly not attractive. China has a lack of real allies. There are also weaknesses associated to the BRI. Many people have presented the BRI as a strategic attempt to create dependency in countries where credits are received, but it's actually the opposite. A chain of strategic defaults is likely, and China may at some point, and it's starting to happen already, may be facing defaults by other countries, and this is a form of sovereign defaults, so that it will have to deal with. There's a lack of military dominance. China's military is still much weaker than the US military. there's a reliance on export growth, and so reliance on the international world economy. Xi Jinping is feared, but not respected inside the Communist Party. So major shock, who knows when it could happen, what time, could lead to an internal political crisis. Instilling fear inside the party, inside the population, and abroad is generally not a long-term winning strategy. So that's actually a sign of weakness. The more aggressive the language, the stronger, the weaker the effect. So to conclude, Janusz Kornai mentioned in 2019 that economic reforms in China created a Frankenstein. China's economic power and size do represent a threat to Asia and to the world. The threat is not related to China's millennial civilization and culture. It's related to the power of the Communist Party of China and the totalitarian Maoist direction that is being taken under Xi Jinping. The US pivot to Asia that was started under the Obama presidency was broken by the Trump presidency. It has to be restored, but it cannot be limited to economic cooperation. Political and military cooperation are important, and they must be strengthened and or established. Other rivalries and disputes inside Asia must take the back seat to the challenge from China's communist regime. And here I have in mind the conflicts between South Korea and Japan. Peaceful coexistence with the Chinese communist regime is possible. I'm not arguing for war, it's possible. But it does require firm containment policies by the international community. Thank you very much.
Sorry. Thank you, Gerald. He's focusing on China issues. So it seems to me his view is relatively some unique and simple. He emphasizing some kind of containment policy against China, strong China. But we'll discuss again this issue maybe even tomorrow. But I'm not sure this kind of argument is consistent with this foundation, this forum's official position. But anyway, I think maybe as long as I know, Gerard is a relatively liberal scholar, but recently his position a little bit changed. But unfortunately, he cannot attend the discussion. So maybe later we may communicate again. Also, we could send some discussion results to him later. Okay. Okay. So due to time limitation, I just move on to second speech. Mr. Kim Won-soo, he'll make his second speech. Please.
Professor Park Jae-hoon, Chairman of Asia Economic Community Foundation, our distinguished speakers, Professor Roland and Dr. Lombardi, our distinguished panelists, Dr. Brada from Arizona State University, Dr. Satoshi Mizobata from Kyoto University, Professor Park Sung-hoon from Korea University, and Professor Yoo Chol of International University. So good to see you again in 1 year in the same forum. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor and distinct pleasure to be invited back to the 12th Asia Economic Community Forum this year. My appreciation should go to Professor Park Jae-hoon and his team for making this meeting possible despite many hurdles caused by COVID-19 pandemic. My special thanks should also go to Professor Brada, Professor Satoshi Mizobata and Dr. Lombardi, who join us today through online. As this year's AECF theme indicates and amplified by former Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, and amplified by Dr. Rowland just now, we are entering the age of hyper uncertainty in Northeast Asia. Northeast Asia stands at a crossroads. Over the last 5 decades, from mid-1970s with the US-China rapprochement, Northeast Asia has served as the engine of growth, not only for the region, but also for the whole world. This was made possible largely thanks to the stable security environment being maintained in the region. Recently, however, these positive trends show troubling signs of going backwards. First, starting from tension rising in the US-China relations and being reinforced by the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. At this juncture, we are witnessing the 3 major clouds of uncertainty hanging over the region. First, the COVID-19 pandemic is wreaking havoc, unprecedented in our lifetime, both on a scale and with an intensity in health, economy, and even politics. It is still ongoing with a number of unknowns, including the speed and power of its mutation. Nobody can predict at this point of time for sure when we can finally overcome it. Though vaccines and treatment medicine still remain yet to be proven wild cards. The longer it takes to overcome the pandemic, the deeper its impact will be, with negative spillover to geopolitical economy and security dynamics in the region. Second, the US presidential election has been just held. I'm pretty sure many of us, including myself, in this room, and joining us online from the United States, Korea, and elsewhere around the world, must have had a sleepless night last night and woke up very early this morning to watch still unfolding drama of the vote counting in the US. It has been so tight that still the final verdict is still early to call, and I'm sure Professor Brada, who joined us from Arizona, must have a lot of things to say, as Arizona turns out to be a surprising key swing state in Biden's favor. So I will leave it to Professor Brada to update us on what will happen in the US presidential election. But I hope, regardless of who wins the election ultimately, the first priority of the winner will be placed on healing the wounds of vision, which have manifested before, during, and after the US election. And depending on who will win ultimately, the foreign policy choice will be between America first again or the reset to multilateralism. If the former Vice President Biden wins, we all know the US foreign policy will be reset with immediate reversal of President Trump's earlier decisions to nullify key multilateral commitments made by the previous administration. Third, North Korea is facing the perfect storm. it seems hard for them to figure out the way for soft landing. The pandemic forced North Korean government to impose their own restrictions on activities in and out of North Korea. These self-imposed restrictions added salt to the existing economic woes, which have been aggravated by the international sanctions, both UN and bilateral, against North Korea's pursuit of nuclear and missile capabilities. US-North Korea talks are in a stalemate. It remains deeply uncertain how and when they can be resumed, under what conditions. To make it worse, these clouds of uncertainty are rising on the horizon at a time when Northeast Asia is already experiencing the triple-level strategic waiting games. At the global level, first, the reviving US-Russia strategic arms competition, with China increasingly in the picture, regardless of whether China likes it or not. Second, at the regional level, the persistent strains in bilateral relations owing to the chronic differences arising from the past history or lingering territorial disputes. And third, at the Korean Peninsula level, the elusive dream of achieving a peaceful and nuclear-free Korean Peninsula. These waiting games happening simultaneously at all levels is both unprecedented and unfortunate. This reminds us of the danger of negative spillover from one to another level to trigger further chain of escalation. The tragedy is that none of the parties involved in these waiting games shows any willingness to make the first move for compromise and only argues that the ball is in the other side's court. So it means stalemate will go on with only heightening risks over time. Unfortunately, the balancing role of the US, which often facilitated compromise in the past, is also fading. As the pandemic remains unsettled, all these waiting games are likely to be prolonged or worsened. But we have no time. We have no time to lose further. We cannot and should not wait until and unless the pandemic is successfully coped with. The particular emphasis should be on mitigating the risk of inadvertent escalation. Tension is likely to rise fast from an unintended incident due to misunderstanding or miscommunication. The risk is all the more acute given the lack of the institutionalized crisis management mechanism working in the region. Northeast Asia, as former Secretary General of the UN eloquently pointed out, remains the crucial missing link in a worldwide web of regional cooperation. Quite often, when serious problems arise, the region needs the talks for talks. This cannot be a good recipe for seeking solutions. Habit of dialogue must be institutionalized. Now, it is up to not only the government, but also the private sector in the region, including academia, to regroup our thinking before it becomes too late. The consequences of inaction would be far costlier to bear than the cost of mitigating actions taken now. waiting is not an option, as it will only heighten the risks. Here are the action items we can consider carefully now. I believe that the two-track thinking for both short and long term is necessary. For the immediate term, the following three items need to be contemplated. First and foremost, the US-China dialogue channels must be restored, must be reset as soon as feasible following the election outcome. This must be done both at the highest and working levels. It goes without saying that US-China relationship holds the key for the continuing stability and prosperity of the region and the world. In view of the long-term power trajectories, as pointed out by Professor Roland just now, US-China rivalry is already set in motion. Regardless of who wins the US election, strategic competition is very likely to get the bipartisan support in the United States. Therefore, no efforts should be spared to ensure the US relations to be US-China relations to be managed in the mode of strategic, cooperative rather than confrontational competition. Of course, cooperative competition requires a lot of hard work and heavy lifting in many areas. It is not easy, as Professor Roland predicted, but my thinking, I think, more confirms more to the thinking of AECF, because strategic cooperative competition is the best possible option, not only for US and China, but also all countries in the region and around the world. Second, the trilateral summit between Korea, Japan, and China needs to be reconvened, hopefully, within this year. Despite a number of lingering political differences and strains, the three countries still have many agendas to work together in their enlightened self-interest. Third, the engagement strategy with North Korea needs to be coordinated and refined among the participants in the six party talks, namely Korea, Japan, China, Russia, and the US, for a peaceful and nuclear-free Korean Peninsula. Without doubt, a stable Korean Peninsula is the prerequisite to a stable Northeast Asia. The longer term also requires the three-way thinking. First, the future visions for regional collaboration need to be harmonized. Currently, two competing visions are emerging, led by China and the United States, respectively. The region would be far better off with reconciled visions. Second, the crisis management mechanism needs to be institutionalized. This would contribute to significantly reducing the risk of tension escalation, as Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, has done so for Europe and Russia. Third, practical ways and means need to be explored for furthering regional integration based on functional approaches. For the bottom-up spillover, it also needs to be complemented by the top-down push at the highest level through the trilateral summit. None of these action items are easy to implement, but it is doable if the countries in the region think in advance and act together. The COVID-19 pandemic is not an obstacle to, but a stark reminder of the imperative for coordinated action. Now is the time to think of a blueprint of action for both immediate and long term. That blueprint needs to reflect our common dream of a Northeast Asia as a hub for the safer and more prosperous world, as well as the better future for all. I hope AECF this year can be the starting point for that tough but meaningful journey. And I thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador Kim Won-soo. Actually, he just touched upon many very important issues. Among them, I just really liked his argument. Waiting is not an option. We need some action, okay? Especially kind of two-track approach. I guess he's talking, this was meaning that this kind of two-track approach could apply to not only for the two Koreas, but also maybe some regional cooperation together. And also he suggested some future tasks. Also, I like his argument saying that crisis management should be institutionalized. As you see, Mr. Zhang Monnet, who is called father of European Union, he always emphasizing institutions matters. Okay, maybe individuals could fade away, but the institution could remain a very long time. So, in that sense, we have to start some institutionalizing our effort. Okay, so I hope we could make some very interesting discussion on this his suggestion. Okay, the next is last speech from the Europe. Dr. Philip Lombardi. He'll talk about the regionalism. Okay, he's pre-recorded video. Please enjoy.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak at the Asia Economic Community Forum 2020. I don't have to tell you that the circumstances are obviously unusual, to say the least. I would have preferred to be with you, obviously, in Korea. It is impossible not to refer to this corona crisis. It is difficult to tell also whether we will go back to the normal at some point in the future. But in any case, I think we will all agree that this corona crisis has been and is a catalyst for reflection on many things, but specifically on how we design policies, the role of the state in the economy, the provision of public goods, also cooperation between states. When going through these health crises all over the world, we have seen the importance of a well-working public health system, the importance of crisis management, the importance of policy coordination, both vertically and horizontally, including cross-border. In some way, we have seen the rediscovery of the state, even if it is unclear whether or which consensus will be established afterwards, or which new consensus will emerge. Now, in any case, all these debates and new views on the role of the state will be sterile if the level of state intervention is not part of the reflection. the adequacy of the level of state intervention is an essential part, an essential aspect of policy making. And this brings me then to the topic of this short intervention, which has as a title, From Old Regionalism to New Regionalism and Back, question mark. What I would like to do in these few minutes is to share a few thoughts with you and reflect briefly on the research agenda for regionalism studies, which is at the heart of concerns at your conference. I will refer to all the new regionalisms, which are, I think, well-known categories, and explore with you what comes next or what could come next. The starting point is this old, what we call old regionalism. Old regionalism refers, first of all, to a first wave of regionalism after World War II, and you could say remained until 1980s, more or less, with the peak, obviously, in the 1960s and 70s. Now, old regionalism is not only about this observation of, let's say, instances of regionalism and region integration in those decades. It also refers to a body of empirical work, a body of conceptual and theoretical frameworks that were developed during that period. This is also when the term and the concept of regional integration has been coined. Now, on the one hand, and from a political science perspective or an IR perspective, this old regionalism has been, I would say, dominated by neo-functionalism, the neo-functionalist approach, which in turn was inspired by federalist thinking and the work on security communities. It was obviously inspired by the European case, even if, and that is sometimes less remembered, even if already very early in the process, the researchers associated with this, with neo-functionalism, embarked on a comparative work. And from the beginning, they had the ambition to build general theory, not European theory, but general theory about regional integration. On the other hand, this old regionalism and the thinking around, the theorizing around old regionalism was dominated by neoclassical economics, trade theory, and customs union theory, but also optimum currency area theory. It is said that old regionalism was state-centered. The research community was very much focused on understanding the mechanics of region integration processes and also the net welfare effects of the creation of trade areas and currency unions. I'm going very brief through these strands in the literature because I'm sure you are familiar with this literature. New regionalism, again, refers to both, let's say, this empirical observation about the dynamics of regionalism as observed, and also to the theorizing that will happen around it. New regionalism refers to a second wave of regionalism with the new peak in the 1990s and the early 2000s. It is associated with the post-Cold War world in which we enter in the 1990s. And it is also associated, obviously, with this wave of globalization, the trend of globalization, which is then taking off. At the ontological level, at the theoretical level, new regionalism calls for a more attention to the cross-regional diversity of the experiences that are lived in different regions of the world. It also has pays attention to the North-South dimension of regionalisms. It abandons the mechanistic view which was part of old regionalism. It looks at regionalism as a social construction where identity, regional identity, becomes an important variable. New regionalism looks at non-state actors, goes beyond the state actors, looks at the informal processes, not only the institutionalized processes. So new regionalism is also a new way of looking at least in part, a new reality. It is less interested in the regional organizations as such, less interested in institution building. With respect to comparative regionalism, new regionalism presents some ambiguity, you could say, with respect to the comparability of the regionalisms that are observed in Asia, the Americas, Africa, Europe. Ambiguity in the sense that there is, on the one hand, more interest in regionalisms worldwide, which is a very positive development. It leads to more comparative work, de facto, but at the same time, there are also more questions about comparability. Are all these different experiences comparable? Because if you emphasize that context is important, it is obviously clear that these experiences take place in different contexts, and then from there you could then ask questions about their comparability and about the feasibility of comparative work. It has been suggested, for example, that the European Union should perhaps be looked at as a special case and is not necessarily a valid point of reference for other experiences. Now, when I suggest in my title, in the last part of my title, this presentation, to go back to old regionalism, this is obviously a bit provocative and should immediately be nuanced, as academics like to do and should do also. First, preliminary remark, it should be noted that there is more, or in any case, more continuity between old and new regionalism than often assumed in the literature. For example, in old regionalism, you already encounter an understanding of the political economy of regionalism, which is by definition involving a variety of actors, not only state actors. I should also immediately say that it is obviously clear that new regionalism has achieved a better and richer understanding also of regionalism by employing different methods and opening, and that is very important, opening the ontological lens. When I say back to old regionalism, I am not referring to going back to this mechanistic view on the makeability of societies and international arrangements. We are, I think, what we have seen over the last years in terms of developments, uncertainties, unpredictabilities, it's very clear that we have to abandon this very optimistic and mechanistic view of society that characterized social sciences in the 1960s, for example. My argument is not about going back to the implicit irreversibility of integration processes, which you observe in old regionalism. On the contrary, we are living Brexit times, and we are very much aware of the reversibility of these processes. It is not about going back to a strict dichotomy between regional cooperation and regional integration, which was very much emphasized by the scholars associated with old regionalism. So, on the contrary, I think we have to be aware and be sensitive to diversity in the institutional arrangements that emerge, that will emerge, and that can coexist. It is also not about going back to a focus on the formal aspects of regional integration, even if formal aspects can also be relevant. It is not about going back to Eurocentric theorizing or the promotion of a European institutional model. On the contrary, I think we have to be aware that Eurocentrism has been and still is a barrier to comparative research in this area and to the involvement also of researchers and research communities from regions worldwide. But when I refer to all regionalism, it is all about the fact, for example, that we should recognize that this all theorizing, even if it originated in a European context, has also generated useful concepts, which are sufficiently abstract to be applied to different other regional contexts. And this should be seen independently of the promotion of the European model by European institutions. That is a different issue. It is about going back to normative work on regional cooperation and integration. It is a call for normative work on regional cooperation and integration. Answering questions like, why do we need regional solutions and policies? I think in the times that we are living currently, these are very important questions. It is about going back to a focus on public policies in multi-level governance contexts. Answering questions like, which are these optimal levels of state intervention? We associate this notion of optimality, obviously, with these mechanistic views of the 1960s, but the questions as such are still relevant. What are optimal levels of government intervention? Sub-state levels, state levels, super-state levels. Which are the governance challenges that should be addressed at the regional level? We should try to answer these questions. And I am aware, of course, with you that the debates on regionalism, integration, disintegration tend to be dominated often by nationalist discourses, political discourses, populist discourses, and we should not be blind for the politics of regionalism. Again, on the contrary, and it should also be on our agenda, or on the agenda of the political scientists that are part of our community. But the role of academia is also to contribute to those debates on regionalism, on region integration, by focusing on policy effectiveness, thereby adopting a citizen perspective. showing where and how regional cooperation and integration can make a difference for citizens, showing that policies at the national level are not always effective to face policy challenges, such as climate, environment, public health, migrations and transborder mobility, more in general, trade and investment, and so on. Showing that disintegration, decentralization are not always the solution, even if they sometimes can be the solution. So my call is for more nuanced views on the levels of policy making, and as far as possible based on evidence, empirical evidence, cases of best practice, and so on. I am also suggesting to put the focus more on the provision of regional public goods. This is also what we are doing at United Nations University, you and you, Chris, where the starting point is, or are, the needs of citizens, leading then to the question, which are these regional public goods that we need and that complement public goods provided at other levels. I think this is of particular importance for small and medium-sized countries. The case of the very large countries in this world, the China's, the United States, the Russia, that is obviously different from the situation and the concerns that live and the interests of small and medium-sized countries, which are the majority in this world. Regional cooperation and or integration is and continues to be important or potentially important for small and medium-sized countries, both from an economic perspective and from a geopolitical perspective. This does not mean that we should think of institutional arrangements as a sort of one-size-fits-all thing. It is, I think, self-evident that the needed institutional arrangements have to be in line and compatible with the local, national, regional contexts and can vary from one region to another. Now, these ideas also correspond with the route that has been taken at UNU Chris, starting from governance challenges in specific policy areas, migration, digital governance, health, and climate, and so on, and then look at the role that regions can play, should play, always in combination with other levels of governance and government, asking questions about policy coherence across levels, across regions. As a UN institution, this also involves work on how the SDGs can be translated into goals at different levels. So I would say, don't hesitate to reach out to us. United Nations University is certainly available to listen to your ideas for new projects and partner up in new adventure. I'm coming to the end of this short intervention. I would like to wish you all a very successful conference. I reiterate my thanks to the organizers and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Philip. So he just talking about the so-called old regionalism, new regionalism, and actually he's talking about the third wave of regionalism. What is that? I guess it is about this diversity and non-state actors, informal processes. More importantly, he is emphasizing some normative work on regional cooperation. I think this is one of the very important things here. And lastly, a citizen perspective. Okay, so this is a really new things in the 21st century or in the age of hyper uncertainty. Lastly, I like this his remark: regionalism of particular importance for small and medium-sized countries. That's why here we are gathering in order to discuss regionalism or Asian Economic Community. Okay, so we just finished all speeches, but actually, Satoshi and Mizabata, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So just please adjust your camera, okay? So okay,
Can I share my slide?
yeah, sure. So I give you time because you just prepare for your own PPT, okay? So just upload his PPT now. You can upload here, okay? Okay.
Can you see my slide?
Yeah, we can
Okay.
see.
大丈夫かな?
Not here? Okay. Okay, just, please start your, actually, you are the discussant, but, actually you prepare your own presentation. Okay, please.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
Okay,
so
thank you very much.
after you, we'll just really start our genuine, discussion. Okay, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you very much, three speakers for the interesting presentations. And should be my role is to comment to today's topic from the Japanese angle. So, and today I examine the Asian economy widely, and using this slide, I would like to comment to today's main topic, Northeast Asians perspective. Okay, and first of all, I would like to confirm the contemporary situation. Needless to say, so we Japanese have the very long tradition for the Asian studies, and recently, the interesting term, Asianizing Asia, is often mentioned among the Asian economic researchers. It sounds a kind of Zen dialogue, or religious dialogues. However, it means Asia goes to the independent way that Asia consumed industrial goods, which Asia produced. So in short, just Asia becomes the producing area and consuming area. So in a sense, Asia just developed de facto economic integration during 20 or 30 years. So at first we must find out this change, drastic change. And under this economic integration, should be global value chain has been organized. At first, I show two tables. Okay. This table shows change of intra-regional trade. You see, in 1990, Asian countries produced goods and they export these goods to North America. North America becomes a main center for consumption. Okay, and after that, of course, at the same time, U.S. organized its own intra-regional trade, and the EU also organized intra-regional trade. However, just now, in 2017, all the Asian countries changed its export direction. It means Japan, Korea, ASEAN, these countries export their goods to Asian countries. So these phenomena may be regarded as Asianizing Asia. Okay, so in a sense, Asia becomes one center for consumption, and at the same time, Asia organized intra-regional trade, which are almost equal to the size of the EU or North America itself. So here I show the one sort of intra-regional integration in Asia. You easily understand during 30 years, Asia achieved high share of the intra-regional trade share, and which almost equal to the level of the EU level. Okay, so these phenomena tell us so Asia has already changed, and based on the intra-regional trade. And of course, this change is based on global value chain. The global value chain has already organized based on the declining transaction cost. Okay. However, unfortunately, Japan cannot adapt to this change sufficiently, and we have already lost our organizational advantages in the division of labor. Anyway, so this is a basic change in Asia, and of course, and at the same time, in the process of this change, so intra-regional trade caused a change of foreign trade structure. You see, this slide shows the intermediate goods trade. Yellow parts, for example, in 1980, 6.6% and 36.1%. These two parts show the intermediate goods in the intra-regional trade in Asia. And this percentage just now, 2017, around 66%. So it means 2/3 of foreign trade, intra-regional trade, becomes so intermediate good trade. Okay, this percentage is higher than America and the EU area. It means our de facto economic integration is very, very closely tied, and Asia has already changed our production network during 20, or should be 20 years. Okay. However, this regional, so this regime has accepted the foreign challenge. So you see, needless to say, first is the US-China conflicts, and second one is COVID-19. And except these two big challenge, should be, we may raise the following important tasks, such as sustainability or demographic problem and innovation problem. Okay, anyway, following today's topic should be US-China is a very important point for the Asian challenge. And at first, we confirm the contemporary situation. Needless to say, so COVID-19 has interpret global value chain. So we can find out a decline of intra-regional trade between Japan and Korea and ASEAN and with China. And of course, at the same time, we can find out the drastic decline of the foreign trade in the world. However, at the same time, the share of declining, the scale of declining in Asia is not so big one compared with Europe and America. Left hand so graph shows the slightly decline of Asia. So it means Asia's network is, in a sense, tougher than any other economic integration. And on the contrary, as for the case of in the world manufactured goods trade, you see textile, computer goods, and integrated circuits. These are the main parts of the Asian intra-regional trade. So therefore, Asian intra-regional trade is, in a sense, very, very strong, even under the COVID-19. However, needless to say, the impact of the American-China conflict are very big one. So paradoxically speaking, so China enjoyed globalization, and America changed its foreign trade direction to protective measures, and should be global value chain, give China a good chance of trade benefits. So. And when we focus in Northeast Asia, should be we can observe both opposite conflicts and cooperation. I mean, any bilateral relations has more or less conflicts and cooperation under the global value chain. So. However, just under the America-China conflict, conflict looks bigger than cooperations. And the reason why this one is to say, I direct to stress the trend politicize the economy and economize politics. So. Particularly, economic and trade sanction becomes an easy way for expressing national interest or one country first policies. So more or less, the contemporary sanction is different from the former ones. Former regionalism, old regionalism in Japan. For example, in 1970s and 80s in Japan. Should be in those days, so economic sanction is has a simple one under the industrial competition. However, the contemporary conflict covers wide range, and it leads to the technological hegemony. In addition, the following 3 points are the most important ones. First of all, economic and trade sanction has extremely wide influence. Here I show the number of parts and value of parts in smartphone of Huawei, China. This percentage shows America and Japan, Korea, Taiwan have dominant position in parts manufacturing. And it means when the American government makes economic sanctions, then should be America itself and Japan, Korea, Taiwan suffer seriously. So it means stakeholder is very wide, become wide. And secondly, the security and the economy are now inseparable, and security itself expands its sphere in the economy and technology. And in special, as military technology expands its bias to the dual use type technology, there is no industry free from security itself. Here shows the recent ban on security problem concerning the IT industry itself. And thirdly, so COVID-19. COVID-19 has expanded security concept. Pharmacy and mask and other general purpose goods and scientists all becomes security goods. So it's very sensible situation just now. And in this case, the basic point is the innovation. Innovation becomes the basic power for technological hegemony itself. And as a very least, under the Asianizing Asia, so China and Korea and Japan, so reached high rank, so enhance their innovation potentials based on the WIPO in ranking itself. However, problem is very simple ones. So institution is huge different among them, in special Chinese institution. Chinese institution is very, very poor compared with other Asian countries. This is why the conflict is very, very strong one. So just I think China institution is huge different from others, and there is big differences on the perspective view in Asia. So then we do have the Asian risk. Asian risks, at the very least, it covers so geopolitical and political conflicts. And moreover, so anti-globalization and isolation by COVID-19 strengthens so these risks. And the risk has become more serious due to economic gaps and budget constraints after COVID-19 under the populist governments. This is a basic risk in Asia. And in addition, China hopes to utilize COVID-19 as a chance for the economic. So it means they hope the economic recovery produce the development of the new industry. And fortunately or unfortunately, U.S. obstruction has made China's innovation more active. And on the other hand, Asia has advantages. So needless to say, the global value chain cannot disappear at once. And Asianizing Asia brings stability in Asia. And in order to keep this trend, should be China obliged to keep globalization and intra-regional network. Okay, so it means just unstable de facto integration need to change into de jure integration. So it means, in a sense, institutionalization is necessary. And as for Japan, sorry, it should be Japan stand on the narrow way because on the one hand, Japan has a challenge to transform Japanese model itself under the global value chain. And on the other hand, Japan and just organizing, Japan has a very, very has a decisive point for decision making between China and America. So just how to say, potential or Japanese economy is very, very restrictive one. However, at the same time, I do not want to undervalue Japanese potentials. On the one hand, Japan has a possibility to adapt new phenomena, and it has this diversified economic structure and unique position in global value chain, which are advantageous position in the global value chain. And secondly, Japan has a potential of solution on developmental problems in Asia. So we do have the, in a sense, rich experience to attack such traditional developmental problems. This is why we do have the potential to export some measures to Northeast Asian countries. Okay, it's my comment to the today's topics. Thank you very much for your attention. It's okay?
Thank you, Satoshi. Actually, I realized that you create very sexy new terminology. Economized politics and politicized economy, and also maybe this is now your own terminology, Asianization. I think this means some kind of, some expansion of two-factor integration. In other words, this is similar to so-called functional integration. Actually, in Asia, we need some institutional integration. Actually, we don't have any kind of, institutional body yet, right? So that's why we are just already talking about we need some regional cooperation body here in Asia. Okay, thank you very much. And I know we have still, panelists. The first, actually, Joe Brother from Arizona State. You are waiting very long time, and I know you are now in very mid-time, right? Maybe.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's a little after midnight here.
Yeah. Please, feel free to talk anything you want.
Okay, well,
Okay.
first I want to say that it's a pleasure to be with you all. The forum is always an opportunity to get stimulating new ideas and to learn new things. Of course, an opportunity to renew acquaintances with old friends and to make new friends. And unfortunately, in this time of COVID, we're not able to take advantage of that aspect of the forum. But nevertheless, it's so far been intellectually interesting and exciting. The speakers in even today, starting with the initial session, talked about difficulties of regional cooperation, conceptual issues, their practical difficulties. We face hyper uncertainty, there's conflict among nations. What struck me in a way is that much of this, I would say a surprising amount of this, was viewed in political or even personal terms. So we've had a lot of stuff about President Trump and America first. We had Xi and the wolf warrior diplomats, and the notion seems to be that what we see and the difficulties that we're seeing are in some sense personal, strong leaders who are doing the wrong thing in some ways. And I want to push back on that a little bit. I want to push back in the sense that what I want to argue is that Xi and Trump are not necessarily strong in any sense, even though they're taking what seem to be rather radical and strong positions. In many ways, I think that actually they're fairly weak, and what they're doing and what we're seeing is driven not by their personalities, but by technological change. Technological change in terms of the third and particularly what is popularly called the fourth industrial revolution. And I view this in, what shall I say, I view this sort of almost in a Marxist sense. So Marx kind of viewed the world made up of two things. There was sort of the superstructure, which was the social and political element, And then underneath that was the economy. And the economy was the basis of the social and political superstructure. And at times, the social structure and the economy were in harmony. When they were in harmony, there was stability and things were going well. But over time, technological change altered what the economy was like. And when it altered what the economy was like, and the social and political structure didn't adjust, you got difficulties, uncertainty, conflict, both within countries and between countries, and among populations, loss in the faith in the existing political system, and then ultimately, potentially, its collapse. Now, why do I think industrial revolutions have something to do with this? Well, industrial revolutions do three things. Number one, they change the relationship between workers and the work they do. The autonomy they have, what it is they contribute to the production process. Industrial revolutions also change the relationship between producers, there's workers and businesses, and the government, and they change the relationships between countries. And just to sort of give you a historical perspective, if you think about it, in the pre-industrial revolution world, labor was everything. It was the source of output. You had some draft animals, but even then, the capacity to utilize them was limited. If you were a farmer, you could use an ox to help you plow your field, but you couldn't say, oh, I'm going to have 40 oxen, and I'm going to use the 40 oxen to pull my plow. It doesn't work that way. So the worker was intimately connected with the work, both in terms of how it was done and in supplying the energy, if you will, to do the production. This meant politically that control over labor was one of the main objectives of the political system. So you had feudalism, slavery, serfdom, what have you, to control labor. And nations competed with each other in those days for what? Largely to have as many workers as possible. So you had the age of empires. Countries tried to expand, get more and more workers, because that meant more and more output, greater wealth. Now, when the first industrial revolution came around in the late 1700s, what was the process here? Well, steam power replaced human power. Workers were now able to control larger amounts of capital. I mean, they had more capital to work with, a machine. There were more things that could be done. So they controlled a lot more, if you will, cooperating resources. But they obviously lost a measure of control over how they did their work, because you had to work according to what the machine wanted you to be doing. Countries competed for markets. This led to colonialism and conflict. So Industrial Revolution changed relations between countries. And it also led to changes in the political system, because in Europe, at the start of the in the middle of the first Industrial Revolution, you had the Congress of Vienna setting up basically a system of governments that were suited to a feudal economy, but they were increasingly trying to run industrial economies. And so you had the revolutions of 1848, which overthrew these regimes. The Meiji Restoration in Japan was kind of an analogous event. The underlying economy changed, the political system didn't, and it couldn't adapt, and therefore it essentially disappeared. The Second Industrial Revolution, which ran from roughly 1870 to 1914, had somewhat different consequences. First of all, I mean, there were different technological changes, mass production, use of electricity, the internal combustion engine, greater efficiency in most of the technologies that had been used in the first industrial revolution. Huge changes in transportation, canals, railroads, shipping costs fell dramatically, communication changes, the telegraph, the telephone. This promoted globalization and better relations between countries. It also, because it was, what shall we say, more technologically intensive, led to the rise of a middle class. People who not only kind of ran the machines, but could actually design them, think about the process, coordinate activities, what have you, okay? And so this led to the possibility of international supply chains. Certainly there were also conflicts in this period, but it was a period of stability and sort of a congruence between the political system and the economic system. The third industrial revolution started in 1949, and it's often called the digital revolution. So digital computing replaced mechanical and analog methods of controlling machines in the production process. And it also replaced the workers' direction of tasks. I mean, there was kind of a bifurcation in the sense that some workers, there's very skilled workers, middle class, basically gained autonomy in the way they did their jobs. And the other workers lost autonomy in the way they did their jobs, okay? But this revolution led to greater connectedness, data processing, expanding the span of control so the supply chain could spread all over the world. This obviously promoted regional integration. And it was a period when, in a sense, because of the nature of the technological changes, you could say that regional integration was a positive sum game. That is, everyone gained through integration. You know, you integrate with some other country, you form a customs union, what have you. Well, you get to do more stuff that you're good at. They get to do stuff that they're good at. And that's a positive gain for everybody. Okay. Now we come to the fourth industrial revolution. This is, I don't know, I'm a little reluctant to kind of go into this because it's become sort of a pop concept. It was developed by Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum. And to some people, this is just sort of a way of creating jobs for management professors to go out and give seminars about this. But essentially what Schwab argues is that the fourth industrial revolution involves automation, the Internet of Things, the smart factory, sensors, and artificial intelligence. Computers increasingly able to control the production process without human intervention. I mean, think of something like autonomous cars. And here in the United States, we're going to get autonomous trucks pretty soon, okay? So this is the fourth industrial revolution. This is what it does. But it has some consequences. What are the consequences? Number one, it's a completely new corporate environment. It's a huge concentration of capitalization on financial markets. That is, if you take the amount of the value, the market value of, you know, the 10 biggest, 20 biggest companies on US stock markets, they have a much bigger share of the total capitalization of those stock markets than we saw any time in the past. So there's a huge concentration. Second of all, these companies have a particular characteristic, which is important for thinking about integration. And that is they're companies that have very high fixed costs, and they have very low or zero marginal costs. Let me give you an example. The opening session was streamed on YouTube. If 500 more people had tuned in to the opening session, the additional cost to YouTube would have been zero. If you download Windows 10 for Microsoft, the marginal cost to Microsoft of you downloading that is zero. If you do a Google search on Fourth Industrial Revolution, the cost to Google of you doing that search is zero. So we have companies that basically have zero or very low marginal cost, high fixed capital cost. What do we teach students those are? Those are natural monopolies. Now we're having a stupid discussion here in the United States about breaking these companies up. It's not that they're evil. It's their very nature. If you have high fixed costs and zero or low marginal cost, you sell as much as possible and you can undersell everyone else. So that means you are going to dominate worldwide. Google does that. Microsoft does that. Other tech companies do that. Okay? So what are the implications for countries of this? The implications are that one country is going to dominate the world in a particular activity or technology, whether it's internet search, or it's computer operating systems, or it's streaming of videos, whatever it may be. It's going to control the whole world, and it's going to be highly profitable. Now, you say to yourself, well, okay, what does that mean? Well, it means that countries think about competition in different ways. So if I'm sitting in China and I say to myself, okay, this is great. China, big economy, our GNP is almost like the United States. But wait a minute, how come it's United States companies that have a worldwide monopoly on operating systems, they have a worldwide monopoly on Google searches, they have a worldwide monopoly on a whole bunch of things, and these things are fantastically profitable. So you say to yourself, okay, is this a system that has gains for everybody? And I think the answer is generally no. So what are countries supposed to do when they face a winner-take-all scenario? This is a zero-sum world. If the US has Google, no one else has a search engine of any value, okay? So one of the questions we have to ask when we talk about the prospects for integration and the role of the United States in this and of China is, do governments understand these issues? Do they understand what I've kind of explained about what's happening? Well, in the United States, Trump complains about technology theft by China, but the rhetoric is mostly focused on manufacturing. That's probably the wrong thing to focus on, okay? So it's unclear that governments anywhere have the capacity to really handle what is happening in terms of technological change. Now, we've seen that the other industrial revolutions either did or didn't bring domestic and international tensions and wars, and so that applies to this one as well. So we have to think about, in a more zero-sum world, what would regional economic integration look like? What would be the basis for people to be willing to participate in regional economic integration? The second problem is, if you can find that basis, can countries really commit to this? Okay? And that is an issue of domestic stability, which we haven't dealt with very much. Do citizens view their governments as capable of dealing with a new situation? If not, then you have pressure for socio-political change. And you saw that, I mean, the US election, we were all sitting around yesterday waiting for a blue wave that never materialized. And the reason it didn't materialize is not because people personally like Donald Trump. It didn't materialize because a large part of the population has lost faith in the ability of the government to deal with fundamental economic issues. Now, why would you say that? Someone earlier on said, oh, you know, demagogues come up and people vote for them. Well, people are not that stupid. They would only vote for demagogues if they thought that they were getting a good deal from non-demagogues. What do we see? In the United States, the distribution of labor has worsened dramatically, okay? That is, say, between 1970 and now, the top 5% of earners in the United States have seen their incomes go up by 50%. Workers below the 50th percentile have seen their incomes fall by 5%. Now, what are these people supposed to think? Our government is handling technological change in a sensible way. They may have the wrong ideas about how to fix it, and they may elect leaders who have the wrong ideas about to fix it. But the point is that a government that's losing the faith of its voters is not in a position to take strong measures that may seem somewhat questionable to people who are not necessarily very sophisticated in economic issues. So, to sum up, leaders need to face the emerging situation. They're not doing it largely because they don't understand it. What they are doing is driven by objective facts. So I think whether Trump wins the election or Biden wins the election, the change in tone may be different, but the underlying policies are not going to change as much as we would think. Now, we don't know where technological change is going to take us in the future, but I think we need to understand that getting to good regional integration is going to require, number one, domestic reform in the political system, or leaders more capable of dealing with the effects of technological change. And it's going to take countries to try to figure out how a new basis for regional economic integration can be created. And this is where I think the forum can really play an important role. So I'll stop there and
Okay, thank you. Joe just really touched up many very important issues. Starting from the agricultural revolution and until up to the fourth industrial revolution, which is happening right now. And also he mentioned, my favorite, idea was Karl Marx's historical materialism, which is emphasizing, importance of the economic factors compared to the superstructure. So I think, Joe's argument is very important and very touching on very serious issues here. So I think maybe someday you may write paper. I like, co-author of this, your paper. Okay, so now we have two speakers here. First, Professor Park Sung-hoon from Korea University, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before I comment or give questions to presenters, I'd like to briefly report what we have discussed in the session 5, which was Korea University session, which carried the title Reconciliation Diplomacy of European Countries and implications for East Asia, the case of Germany. Why the reconciliation diplomacy? Because we have discussed many things today morning and today afternoon in the plenary session. Difficulties, obstacles to regional cooperation and integration. And we thought at the core of these problems is the non-existence or the insufficiency of the reconciliation diplomacy in East Asian context. So that, in fact, we at Korea University's EU Center have started a small project, 2-year project, starting from this year, ending next year, for educating and researching on the reconciliation diplomacy of Europe and how to apply, if possible, in the Northeast Asian and East Asian region. And the session 5 of today was reporting the interim result of our study. We have got the 4 papers, one by a German professor at the University of Munich, reporting about the history of German reconciliation diplomacy. It was a pre-recorded video form, and we have got a very interesting discussion based on 3 additional presentations by one professor and one visiting fellow at the EU Center, and then one master candidate of Korea University's Graduate School of International Studies. The project I'm carrying now is consisting of 9 papers commissioned to 9 people. And it will be ending this month or next, and then we have planned to publish that book. And when we publish, I probably would like to invite Professor Park Jae-hoon, who is a long-lasting colleague and senior friend of mine, for making some comments on that. I'd like to summarize the results of the discussion in 4 or 5 points. Number 1 point is that we have come to a kind of tentative conclusion that the reconciliation is a long-lasting process. Long-lasting process with many ups and downs. Because you can have unexpected obstacles, you have to have some adjustment as well. And also, there should be some contingency plan to overcome these obstacles and downs in particular. Number 2 point I'd like to mention here is that 2 dimensions have to go hand in hand when you'd like to have successful reconciliation diplomacy. Political process and, more importantly, cultural process. In political process, that is number 3 now. In political process, important is to have adequate leadership, and the leadership chemistry is very important. As shown in the very successful adoption and application of Elysee Treaty between France and Germany in 1963. And also, we, in Korea-Japan relations, we had a similar declaration between Kim Dae-jung and Obuchi in 1980. And because this was not accompanied by the second element, which is cultural process, it was not so successful. So one of our conclusions was that we have to have these 2 dimensions hand in hand to have a maximum impact of these diplomacy efforts. So in politics, number 3 is in politics you have leadership. It's very important, but also important is to have functional factors and functional actors. And in functional actors, you have, as mentioned by Ambassador Kim and also mentioned by other people, the civil society and NGO people. It's very important to involve these people in addition to the politics, because we know that the summitry and summit diplomacy is important. However, if it's not backed up by wide-ranged civil society intervention and involvement, the summitry can only end up with some declaration, and it could be only a talk shop, right? So that without any impact. That is quite important. And in cultural sphere, we come to a conclusion that conversation and communication is important. Very important is to continuously provide opportunities for expanding communications, interpersonal and also political communications as well. And also very important is to keep and to protect the value of memory. Memory is very important, and this was very succinctly manifested by the Germany's efforts to write the history textbooks together with other countries. For instance, German-France Joint Commission of Historians was mentioned, and also they have had some textbook commission with Poland, Russia, Czech Republic, and Slovak Republic as well. So the initial efforts made between Germany and France was expanded to other countries, and that is, I think, the core of German reconciliation diplomacy. My point number 4 is if you would like to have maximum impact of such efforts, then it should be anchored especially into the regional cooperation and integration scheme. Professor Satoshi has mentioned about the de jure integration, which is practically meant by institutionalization. So as we have, it was not reported in the session, but in our workshop about the reconciliation diplomacy, we have discussed why the Obuchi Kim Dae-jung declaration has failed. Why it did not bring about tangible achievement. And we discovered that it was not institutionalized. In contrast to the German case, German and French case, because in the Alger Treaty, you will find one institution which was created by the Alger Treaty, which is France-German Youth Office. So we call FGYO. And the FGYO was researched by a German student, Karina Maivek, who is here. And she was really very interestingly reporting about the achievement of this office. And one program I'd like to mention is the Voltaire program, which is kind of exchange program between the French and German young generation. And this was, in this Voltaire program, the young generation of France and Germany, they have also had the desire to combine this experience with their wish to develop their career, right? But if you have no kind of regional cooperation and integration programs at work, then you cannot easily think of combining the experience of exchange with the career development plans of youth. So that we came to the recognition that for having maximum efforts from this reconciliation diplomacy, it is very crucial to have had the background and the foundation for regional cooperation and integration. That's what I wanted to mention in my report about sessions. I have several questions and comments, especially to Professor Roland, but he's not there. So some questions I'd like to direct to Ambassador Kim because he has a wide range of experiences in public and international diplomacy, so that probably we can have some kind of constructive discussion. I'd like to recall my experience with Helmut Schmidt 25 years ago. I was going to Germany together with my boss at the time. I was working for a government think tank, Korea Institute for International Economic Policy. It was 1995. If you are aware, I mean, if you see this year, 1995, that is the 50th anniversary of Korea's liberation from Japanese colonial ruling. And the Korean government wanted to have some event celebrating that, as well as in the context of that timing, the two Germanys were united 5 years ago, right? Because the unification of Germany was taking place in 1990, so that we wanted to learn some lessons from Germany. And we have contacted Helmut Schmidt, and then the two bosses have been discussing. Helmut Schmidt was giving insightful observations to us about the German unification. But at one point of their discussion, he was asking us as well, with the question, you have some difficulties vis-a-vis Japan, right? So, and if you take a look at the Franco-German relationship, it has improved a lot compared to 19th and 20th century, right? They have had 2-3 wars against each other. And now if you take a look at the Franco-German relationship, the two countries have built up certain kind of tandem to lead the European integration. Whenever the European countries have difficulties, then France and Germany, they tried to solve, right, representing some like-minded countries' interests. And then he asked, do you know how it was possible? And do you know who stretched hands first? We were struck by this question because we were not prepared for that question. And his answer was, it was not Germany that stretched the hands first. It was France that did it. Of course, we discussed that, and also the Professor Wilsching, who was the keynote speaker in our session, he was reporting the desire of France to have the access to coal and steel, right? So that the Ruhr and Saar region of France and Germany, they have had some ambition to have this territory as a French territory. However, they have changed their mind. And stretching hands to Germany was made first by France. That was a striking moment for me, and this memory is lasting in my mind for 25 years. I still remember that. Of course, we have problems with Japan. We have a feeling that Japan did not enough, right? Did not do enough to reconcile with other countries. But the same question we have to ask to Korea as well, whether Korea did do enough to reconcile with Japan and other countries. So with this question, I think I'd like to ask Ambassador Kim. So because you have had vast experiences with dealing with international affairs and conflict resolution, as well as the reconciliation, right? So how important it is to have the reconciliation. And we say that if you compare the European and Asian contexts, the contexts are so different so that we might not have reconciliation now. What is your view about that? That is my question to you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your discussion.
Sorry, I'd like to add another point.
Okay.
I was really very pleasantly surprised by a passage in the program. If you see the program and see the cover page showing Professor Park Jae-hoon's photo, I'd like to mention this. I wanted to mention this really, that he has the ambition to make Incheon as Asia's Brussels. I will assist you in your long journey from now to make it happen. And congratulations for having this idea and public. And I wish you all the best in your efforts.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Professor Park. Okay, he just summarized his own session, which was held in the morning, this morning, and that session is about the reconciliation diplomat, especially of the Germany and Franco. And he summarized, and also he suggested some question. Okay, now our last discussion, Professor Lee, you wait for a time.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Ho-Chul Lee. I am teaching at the International University, Political Science Department. On my way to this place, I felt I was here just a couple of weeks ago. When I met Professor Park Seung-hoon, I thought I met him just a couple of weeks ago, but we are meeting in 1 year. So I thought, why I feel time goes such a fast way? Probably because of one reason, I am getting old. Do you know the time goes at the speed of your age? If you are in 40s, the time goes 40 kilometers per hour. If you are in 30s, time goes 30 kilometers per hour speed. So probably the one reason might be I am getting old. However, more important thing, probably because of the COVID pandemic, we are living every day same daily life, day by day. We cannot travel, abroad. We cannot go clubs. We cannot go drinking bars. I mean, we are living same day, every day. That's probably the reason why I felt more than any other time, the time goes so fast. That's why I met Professor Park Jae-hoon just a couple of weeks ago. In fact, it was 1 year ago. My role is discussant. The COVID pandemic makes everything uncertain, as Ambassador Kim Won-soo talked about. So let me briefly give my comment on 3 speakers, beginning with Ambassador Kim Won-soo. His point of view, I felt a little dark a little negative prospect, probably because of the COVID pandemic, and also many, uncertain international political circumstances in Northeast Asia. But I think one uncertainty is coming to the end. The US presidential election. Joe Biden probably almost will be the next president of the United States, which makes one uncertainty is coming to the end. And I think the democratic leadership of the United States will not be the same as the Donald Trump administration. Probably the US might restore its global leadership and multilateralism. And probably the US-China relations under new leadership will be reset in a more rule and norm-based relationship. And therefore, in a more stabilized relationship. Although the rebalancing of the United States and China's counterbalancing in terms of geopolitics and power politics will continue even under the new administration of the United States. Nevertheless, the two countries will restore the previous communication channels, such as a strategic and economic dialogue between two countries. Also, US and North Korean dialogue would be resumed, but in a different way, probably from bottom-up process and in a more principled and norm-based processes. US-South Korea alliance relationship, I think, will be more stabilized than under Trump administration. So, Ambassador Kim, a little dark prospect that I added one more enlightening aspect of the US leadership change will bring on Northeast Asia. Let me move on. Professor Philip de Lombardi, your idea about the old regionalism and new regionalism, I think make a good point. But I wonder, under this unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic situation, I wonder why any regional cooperation to handle the COVID pandemic even has not been sought yet, even under new regionalism perspective, or even under citizen level regionalism. I mean, this is all citizens in this region suffering from the COVID pandemic, but I wonder why any regional cooperative measures has not been yet sought for, even in citizen level. One reason probably because of the tit-for-tat blaming between President Trump and President Xi Jinping. And President Moon Jae-in of South Korean government, he suggested an idea of Northeast Asian cooperation for the COVID pandemic at his speech at the UN General Assembly just a couple of weeks ago. But that idea is not gaining any regional support yet. And I wonder why all people in this region commonly suffering this COVID pandemic, why any sort of regional cooperation, whether old or new regionalism, is not, tried at all. Let's move on. Professor Gerald Roland. I'm teaching Chinese politics in my school. Also, my major research area is China. And when I looked over Professor Gerald Roland's presentation, I was so surprised. I know Professor Park Jae-hoon introduced him. He is a kind of a liberal scholar teaching at UC Berkeley. But his presentation is very, very strong point of view against rising China. So let me, a couple of comments about his presentation. First, a new Cold War. Is it, can we agree on a new Cold War between US and China? My conclusion is it's a little too much exaggerated perception of the US and China rivalry, because US and China is economically too much interdependent each other. China earns a lot of money from US market. China has the huge exchange reserve, the top in the world, more than $3 trillion. Most of them earned from US market, from the trade surplus from the US. They are very much economically interdependent. Second, I don't see any ideological confrontation between US and China. Is China a communist country? The ruling party is a Chinese Communist Party, but Chinese Communist Party is not anymore a communist party. Jiang Zemin, the previous president of China, he added one new basic principle of the Communist Party of China in the name of three representatives. Three representatives means the Chinese Communist Party should represent not just labor and farmers. That's orthodox traditional Communist Party representation. But he added the Communist Party of China should represent the entrepreneur, the financiers, the advanced economic productive forces. Also, Communist Party of China should represent the new advanced Chinese intellectuals. So in terms of the three representatives, the Chinese Communist Party is not a communist party anymore. So even Chinese communist leaders, they don't think they are stick on communism at this time. So I cannot see any ideological confrontation between US and China, as was the Soviet Union and the United States after the Second World War. Probably the Chinese regime is more close to authoritarian developmental state rather than a orthodox communist country. Second point, between the China and US rivalry, certainly there is a geopolitical strategic competition. US rebalancing against the rising China, and China's counterbalancing against the United States. And two strategic competition, rebalancing and counterbalancing, is clashing now mostly in South China Sea. And the Belt and Road Initiative of the Xi Jinping, first of all, is a geo-economic strategy. But in more profoundly, it is geopolitical strategy, which is against, against U.S. rebalancing or U.S. encircling China. That will continue. However, that strategic competition is not a new Cold War. My third point on Professor Roland is, so do we need a full version of containment against rising China? He proposed all democratic countries in Asia, including South Korea, Japan, many ASEAN countries should join a region-wide democratic containment bloc against rising China. I mean, it's going to be a very hard, agony to South Korean government. As we all know, I mean, the economic relationship with China is very important to Korea, but U.S.-Korea alliance is also one security pillar of Korea. So such a, containing rising China will generate a very difficult choice to many countries, not just to South Korea, but even to Japan. I mean, Japan and China's economic relations is very, important to Japan. So such a, a full, containment against rising China, really we need it. I mean, it is very hard for me to agree on that idea. Okay, thank you. Let me stop here.
Insightful discussion. Okay, now just we finished presentation and discussion. So now just going back to some response from the speakers. So maybe General Roland is not here today, and the second speaker, Ambassador Kim, maybe you may have some comment or some response. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. First of all, I learned a lot from today's discussion and from Satoshi Mizabata and also Professor Brada about the importance to understand the underlying economic and technological changes and their implications on the high politics. So thank you so much for informing us about that aspect. Now coming to the first question by Professor Park Sung-hoon to comment on Korea-Japan relationship on behalf of or instead of Professor Roland. And because I'm now retired from government service, so I don't speak for the government, but I can speak for the thinking President Kim Dae-jung had, because at the time I worked at the Blue House to advise him on foreign policy, because I was sent by the Foreign Ministry to work at the Blue House. And as I understand, his thinking is exactly along the lines you described, offering hands first from victims' side, but also showing that we are ready to receive, starting from cultural areas, although there's a lot of concern at the time from the Korean public that if we prematurely open our cultural market to Japanese, then we may be overrun again. But President Kim Dae-jung offered that as the first gesture, starting from maybe softer areas so that it can spill over from bottom up to more sensitive areas. It worked, and it is too bad to see that initiative was not long-lived because of a number of factors, including unexpected death of Prime Minister Obuchi, premature death of Prime Minister Obuchi, and the lack of institutionalization. But I understand that President Kim Dae-jung offered that along the spirit of former president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, did. His line of thinking was the historical problems we can never solve, but from the victim side, forgive but not forget is the best approach we should employ. And as Professor Park Sung-hoon, also I think he had the answer himself, but I agree with his view that Korea and Japan have many things to share. We share democracy and liberal values, and also we share a lot of security concerns, so many reasons to work together. And I think that thinking will eventually prevail on the leaders both in Korea and Japan, and also I think the private sector, including civil society and academia, has a lot of role to play. Second question from Professor Leo Cho about Korea-US alliance. I think if former Vice President Biden wins, I think his instinct will be to reset and go back to what President Obama and Vice President Biden tried at the time. So on disarmament challenges, I think the first thing he will do is to restore JCPOA with Iran and resume engagement with Iran on that basis. On North Korea, I hope new engagement policy with North Korea will be seriously contemplated by the new team who will advise the former Vice President Biden if he wins. But I hope it will not go back to strategic patience, because strategic patience, we all know, didn't work. To solve the problem, we have to engage. Maybe with a different modality, with the different conditions set, with also clear parameters to set before the resumption of US-North Korea dialogue. And I'm sure that the Korea-US alliance will continue to be the bedrock for foreign policies for the US and Korea in the region and around the world, because Korea and US now become value-sharing alliance as well. So we share not only regional interest but also global interest, and I hope US-Korea alliance will become healthier and principle-based, as Professor Liu Cho said. And taking this chance, I want to ask one question back to Professor Brada, because I'm so intrigued by his observation that without understanding underlying technological changes and their implications for high politics, any policy, particularly foreign policy, cannot succeed. So if you are asked by the new administration of the US, what advice will you offer? particularly how to deal with China.
Okay, then we have another speaker, Philip Romarede from Europe, but he's not here. Philip, can you hear me? Please turn on your, camera or speaker. Hello? Philip? No, he's not here. Okay, so actually he is invited, and I know he's stayed there, but maybe some technical problems, Okay, then maybe first of all, Joe, you just got some question to you, so please try to answer anything. Joe? Hello?
Yep, I'm here. Okay, my feeling on this is that the president, well, assuming it's President Biden's range of options in dealing with China is going to be relatively limited. In the, I mean, you kind of think, okay, he's got some advisor sitting there who's gone through all of Trump's actions towards China, all his presidential executive orders, what have you. And on day one, Biden's going to come into office and tear all those up and say, we're resetting. I think there can be a reset in atmospherics. I mean, clearly, I don't think it's been helpful for the Trump administration to try to bully China to kind of, what shall I say, thwart Chinese efforts at doing things that are fairly legitimate. I mean, the fact that China wants to have a made in China policy, which improves their technological status, you can say, we think industrial policy works or doesn't work. It obviously has some implications for China's obligations under the World Trade Organization. But at the end, you can't say, oh, you can't do anything about your technological level and how you develop your industries. I mean, that I think is beyond what you can claim. I think that given what's been said about China in the US and the attitude towards China, it would be very hard for him to make a 180-degree turn and return to kind of almost benign neglect of Chinese behavior. So I think he's stuck with what we have until and unless he develops more domestic credibility. And I talk about government competence, and I think that's important. Until American voters are really willing to accept that something else can be done, rather than just being punitive with China, it's going to be difficult to take concrete steps. So, for example, I think lifting tariffs won't be as easy as one might think. I think certainly at the political level, I think we can hope for a little better détente, more communication, what have you. But in terms of the concrete things that are in place, it's not going to be all that easy to replace them. And I think replacing them really does depend on getting the trust of voters. I mean, kind of people mention Arizona, what have you. We had a Senate campaign here, and Mark Kelly, who was the Democratic candidate, I'd say 50% of the ads were that he was in bed with China, he got money from China, he was riding a motorcycle and had little Chinese flags on the handlebars. And it was like, you know, the campaign was against China. The hell with Kelly. We're anti-China. So there's that kind of mindset that exists. And however Biden may feel about these things, you can't just ignore that in the electorate.
Joe?
Yeah,
Oh, you finished?
I'm finished. Yeah, that's
Okay, thank you. Okay, so how about the Satoshi? You have some words to comment?
Okay, so thank you very much for discussion and comments. I don't have any specific question to me. However, I'd like to stress a few points. So, as Joe insisted, is the point. So, the fourth industrial revolution has potential to change society itself, and so it means technology becomes decisive for understanding the contemporary society, and should be just now. Market rule itself is under the redesign, so due to such technological change. So this is why the topic becomes very confusing, and the impact of the state become greater, larger than before. And under this situation, as I told you, so Asianizing. So Asianization means Asia has drastically changed just now. So Asianizing Asia is not old regionalism. So once again, I'd like to emphasize this aspect. So under the former regionalism, so de facto integration become a main engine for cooperating, for example, China, Korea, Japan. And as in this de facto integration, so institution is not so serious problem. So I mean, all the players can make compromise. So all the players can neglect such institution for growth itself. However, just now under the naive global value chain, such attitude must change. So this is why just so these countries, Asia needs the de jure integration. So, however, Asia is not different. It is different from EU, Europe. So, in order to design de jure integration, we need the common interest from the viewpoint of cultural process. So Professor Park insisted. So I think how to build such common interest, common cultural dimension becomes a very important target for the cooperation in the Asian regionalism. It's my opinion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Satoshi. Okay, just we finished all speakers to hear, but actually we have many audiences, especially young students. So, is there any question? Is the last moment? Okay, so please give Dr. Ki to the the microphone. Please introduce yourself and.
Yeah, I'm Xiong Ki, a research-intensive professor for International University. My first question goes to, just one question goes to Ambassador Kim Won-soo. Like the rest of the world, our region's multilateral cooperation is in grave danger due to the Russian surge of nationalism, unilateral policies by major power states, and the spread of COVID-19. given these circumstances, how do you assess the roles of middle power states like Australia and South Korea in the process of pursuing a range of measures to reinvent multilateralism in this region? Thank you.
Thanks for the question, but also I think the part of the answer was was already given through our discussion. The role of medium-sized countries will become, I think, more important, because when the two biggest countries, economically and politically, remain at odds with each other, global solutions are hard to be expected to come from leadership of those biggest powers. Then I think the vacuum needs to be filled up, and there are countries like Korea and also Australia and countries in Europe have common interest in thinking about a solution, global solution, which can be acceptable to both biggest powers, but also to the rest of the world. So I hope the gap we are discussing today, and we remain seriously concerned at, and I hope with the new leadership taking over at the White House, I think we'll address that problem significantly, but still, if we assume we'll continue to have a gap in global leadership, then I hope that middle power alliance, I would call it coalition of the willing and able, will play a more proactive role. So I hope coordination between middle powers, including Korea, Australia, and also Japan, and countries like Indonesia, Singapore in Southeast Asia, and also European countries will come along more proactively.
Then how do you assess the current status of the current the Moon Jae-in administration regional integration policy, such as the New Southern Policy? Do you think does this policy work to bridge the gap between the two competing blocs?
I hope so, because I think that's the sort of consistent policy pursued by, I think, all previous presidents, starting from former President Notehu, Nord-Politik, and succeeded by the succeeding presidencies, because there we have a new frontiers. We can expand our diplomatic horizon, and through that, hopefully, we can play some role, bridging role, to harmonize two competing visions, which I explained. So I hope Korea in the middle to play a much more productive and proactive role in bridging the gap in two competing visions coming from two biggest powers. And even when we pursue a trilateral summit, even we see the dynamics that if the same initiative comes from either Japan or China, the other side immediately takes it with some suspicion about hidden agenda. But same idea comes from Korea, acceptability by our two bigger neighbors goes down much more significantly. So that way, I hope Korea can play a role in bridging two competing visions by the two most powerful states in the region.
Okay, thank you. So, we are almost spent almost 3 hours. Initially, I just planned that we're going to have 2 plenary sessions, but I just merged it, 2 plenary sessions into 1. But it turned out that we spent almost 3 hours. So we failed in saving time. But anyway, so it's a very pleasure to have seen that this discussion is very productive and meaningful, and so very activating some new idea. And also I just emphasize one thing is that this is a very unique situation. So we just invent a very new paradigm for conference. As you see here, we just invited foreign participants by pre-recording video and some Zoom participation, and but maybe two speakers cannot participate in Zoom, but actually I think it's very enough to say that it is very successful. So now I'm happy to say that the presentation is ended. Thank you.
네, 긴 시간 동안 수고해 주셨습니다. 총회 주제가 동북아와 유럽의 비교 시각에서 본 지역 통합의 정치 경제학으로 총회를 진행해 주셨는데요. 수고해 주신 좌장님 그리고 연사분들께 여러분 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드리겠습니다. Okay, thank you very much for staying with us until the end, and moderators and speakers and audiences also thank you. You have participated in the entire session with the theme of political economy of regional integration from the comparative perspective of Northeast Asia and Europe. So we deeply appreciate the moderator and speakers for your hard work. So would you please give a round of applause once more to them? 네, 그리고 멀리 해외에서도 접속을 해주셨죠. 특히 조셉 브라다 교수님께서는요, 내일 있을 종합 토론 세션에서 다시 뵙도록 하겠습니다. Professor Joseph Brada will see you again in tomorrow's comprehensive discussion session as well. 네, 이렇게 해서 2020 아시아 경제 공동체 포럼 첫째 날 일정을 모두 마치도록 하겠습니다. 네, 긴 시간 동안 온라인으로 그리고 오프라인으로 함께 해주신 여러분들께 다시 한번 감사 인사드리도록 하겠습니다. Now, this is the end for the first day of the 2020 Asian Economic Community Forum has been completed. Thank you again to everyone who has been with us online and offline for a long time. 네, 그리고 내일 2일차 프로그램이 준비되어 있습니다. 아침 9시부터 시작이 된다는 점 기억을 해주시고요. The second day program tomorrow is fully prepared and will start from 9 in the morning. 네, 그리고 내일 오전에는 사단법인 아시아경제공동체재단의 산하단체죠. 청년위원회와 또 모의 아시아연합총회 조직위원회가 공동 주관하는 모의 아시아연합총회가 오전 9시부터 유튜브로 역시 생중계될 예정입니다. Tomorrow morning, the Model Asian Union, that is MAU, co-hosted by the Youth Committee and the Organizing Committee of the Asian Economic Community Foundation, affiliated with the Asian Economic Community Foundation, will be broadcasted live on YouTube from 9 a.m. 네, 그리고 모의 아시아 연합 총회는요, 포럼 개최 전 치열한 예선을 거쳐서 총 6팀이 본선에 올랐고요. 내일 경합을 벌일 예정이라고 합니다. 여러분들 많은 관심 부탁드리겠습니다. For the Model Asian Union, we have a total of 6 teams going through a fierce rounds before the forum, and they will compete tomorrow. So please make sure you have your attention on this event as well.
잠깐 내가 얘기 좀 더 안 나가서 여러분들이. Hi Joe, I still there? Okay, thank you for your participating through the midnight. I know that you are already.
My pleasure.
Okay, so I hope we see you tomorrow again.
We'll see
okay.
you tomorrow.
Okay,
Yeah,
and
look forward to it.
Okay, and Satoshi also thank you for your participating. Okay. Okay, see you later soon. I hope in person. Okay. Please remain safe and healthy. Okay. Okay.
Yes.
Bye bye.
I guess they are just watching the whole situation here just on the screen, through the screen. So, 네. 그리고 말씀드린 대로 또 오후 일정에는요, 오늘과 내일 이틀간 논의된 내용을 바탕으로 종합 토론의 시간이 마련이 되어 있습니다. 여러분 역시나 끝까지 관심 가져주시면 감사하겠습니다. And as well, in the afternoon tomorrow, we'll have time for comprehensive discussion based on the discussions from today and tomorrow. So please pay attention to the end. 네, 그리고 지금 현장에 계신 분들께 말씀을 드리도록 하겠습니다. 잠시 장례를 정리한 후 이어서 환영 만찬이 진행이 될 예정입니다. 잠시 휴식 시간 가지시고 또 만찬에 참석을 해주시면 감사하겠습니다. And for those who are here on the site, so we'll have a welcome dinner after a while. So please take a break. Feel free to take a break for a while, and then we'll see you again. Thank you very much. 여러분 감사합니다.